All right, enough of that. The Putin doctrine. A move on Ukraine has always been part of the plan. Angela Stent, January 27th, that's today, 2022. The current crisis between Russia and Ukraine is a reckoning that has been 30 years in the making. It is about much more than Ukraine and its possible NATO membership. It is about the future of the European order, crafted after the Soviet Union's collapse. During the 1990s, the United States and its allies designed a Euro-Atlantic security architecture in which Russia had no clear commitment or stake. And since Russian President Vladimir Putin came to power, Russia has been challenging that system. Putin has routinely complained that the global order ignores Russia's security concerns, and he has demanded that the West recognize Moscow's right to a sphere of privileged interests in the post-Soviet space. He has staged incursions into neighboring states, such as Georgia, that have moved out of Russia's orbit in order to prevent them from fully reorienting. Putin has now taken this approach one step further. He's threatening a far more comprehensive invasion of Ukraine than the annexation of Crimea and the intervention in the Donbass that Russia carried out in 2014, an invasion that would undermine the current order and potentially reassert Russia's preeminence in what he insists is its rightful place on the European continent and in world affairs. What does it mean for a country to have a rightful place in world affairs? And is Putin's insistence that Russia has a rightful place justified? He sees this as a good time to act, and several of our live streams have shown that Putin's holding all the cards, that Putin's in a good position to do what he wants to do, to take advantage of divisions in Europe, in America, and the strength that Russia has gained over the last 8-9 years after its experience in Crimea and Donbass. In his view, the United States is weak, divided, and less able to pursue a coherent foreign policy. His decades in office have made him much more cynical about the United States' staying power. Putin is now dealing with his fifth U.S. president, maybe not the most imposing of them, and he's come to see Washington as an unreliable interlocutor. The new German government is still finding its political feet. Europe on the whole is focused on its domestic challenges, and the tight energy market gives Russia more leverage over the continent. In other words, once again, we see Putin in a good position. The Kremlin believes that it can bank on Beijing's support, just as China supported Russia after the West tried to isolate it in 2014. Putin may still decide not to invade, but whether he does or not, the Russian president's behavior is being driven by an interlocking set of foreign policy principles that suggest Moscow will be disruptive in the years to come. Call it the Putin doctrine. The core element of this doctrine is getting the West to treat Russia as if it were the Soviet Union, a power to be respected and feared with special rights in its neighborhood and a voice in every serious international matter. I think it's about time Western policy analysts dropped the reference to the Soviet Union, thought more in terms of the Eurasian space. In other words, thought more in terms of the language that Russia's actually using to conceive of its geopolitics and economic union and ideological dimension of its politics. But okay, fine. A power to be respected and feared with special rights in its neighborhood and a voice in every serious international matter. So in that sense, a world power. The doctrine holds that only a few states should have this kind of authority, along with complete sovereignty, and that others must bow to their wishes. It entails defending incumbent authoritarian regimes and undermining democracies. And the doctrine is tied together by Putin's overarching aim, reversing the consequences of the Soviet collapse, splitting the transatlantic alliance, and renegotiating the geographic settlement that ended the Cold War. Russia, according to Putin, has an absolute right to a seat at the table on all major international decisions. The West should recognize that Russia belongs to the global board of directors. After what Putin portrays as the humiliation of the 1990s, the article continues, when a greatly weakened Russia was forced to accede to an agenda set by the United States and its European allies, he's largely achieved this goal. By the way, this is not really new stuff. I mean, there are a million different sources presenting this kind of picture of Putin and his vision for Russia's place in the world. You could even look at Geopolitics of Contemporary Russia, Last War of the World Island by Alexander Dugin, book that I translated, just to mention one, although there are many others as well. Nevertheless, let's continue. Even though Moscow was ejected from the G8 after its annexation of Crimea, its veto on the United Nations Security Council and role as an energy, nuclear, and geographic superpower ensure that the rest of the world must take its views into account. Russia successfully rebuilt its military after the 2008 war with Georgia, and it is now the preeminent regional military power with the capability to project power globally. Moscow's ability to threaten its neighbors enables it to force the West to the negotiating table, as has been so evident in the past few weeks. As far as Putin is concerned, the use of force is perfectly appropriate if Russia believes that its security is threatened. Russia's interests are as legitimate as those of the West, and Putin asserts that the United States and Europe have been disregarding them. Again, an old story, but it's a new article. I thought we'd go over it. For the most part, the United States and Europe have rejected the Kremlin's narrative of grievance, which centers most notably on the breakup of the Soviet Union, especially the separation of Ukraine from Russia. When Putin described the Soviet collapse as a great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, he was lamenting the fact that 25 million Russians found themselves outside of Russia, and he particularly criticized the fact that 12 million Russians found themselves in the new Ukrainian state. As he wrote in a 5,000-word treatise published last summer entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and I actually have that here for us to read somewhere, right there. So we'll get to it. In 1991, people found themselves abroad overnight, taken away, this time indeed from their historical motherland. His essay has recently been distributed to Russian troops. This narrative of loss to the West is tied into a particular obsession of Putin's, the idea that NATO, not content to merely admit or aid post-Soviet states, might threaten Russia itself. The Kremlin insists that this preoccupation is based on real concerns. Russia, after all, has been repeatedly invaded from the West. In the 20th century, it was invaded by anti-Bolshevik allied forces, including some from the United States. During its civil war from 1917 to 1922, Germany invaded twice, leading to the loss of 26 million Soviet citizens in World War II. Putin has explicitly linked this history to Russia's current concerns about NATO infrastructure nearing Russia's borders and Moscow's resulting demands for security guarantees. It's not like the Russian people, the Russian state, and the Russian memory have no justification for fearing foreign invasion. Today, however, Russia is a nuclear superpower, brandishing new hypersonic missiles. No country, least of all its smaller, weaker neighbors, has any intention of invading Russia. Indeed, the country's neighbors to its west have a different narrative, or I never was a big fan of that word in political affairs, different interpretation, different perspective, a different understanding, and stress their vulnerability over the centuries to invasion from Russia. The United States would also never attack, although Putin has accused it of seeking to cut a juicy piece of our pie. Nevertheless, the historical self-perception of Russia's vulnerability resonates with the country's population. Government-controlled media are filled with claims that Ukraine could be a launching pad for NATO aggression. Indeed, in his essay last year, Putin wrote that Ukraine was being turned into a springboard against Russia. And you know now that the Ukraine has raised a credible threat against Russia. The weapons and support are flowing in, probably exacerbating this impression that Ukraine could be a springboard against Russia. Putin also believes that Russia has an absolute right to a sphere of privileged interests in the post-Soviet space. You don't just have a single rules-based order. You have spheres of influence, or the great spaces, cultural and civilizational, of a multipolar world. This means its former Soviet neighbors should not join any alliances that are deemed hostile to Moscow, particularly NATO or the European Union. Putin has made this demand clear in the two treaties proposed by the Kremlin recently, on December 17th, which require that Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries, as well as Sweden and Finland, commit to permanent neutrality and eschew seeking NATO membership. NATO would also have to retreat to its 1997 military posture before its first enlargement. by removing all troops and equipment in Central and Eastern Europe. As you remember from previous live streams, if you happen to be there, or from the news that you've been reading, these are considered non-starters by the US. This would reduce NATO's military presence to what it was when the Soviet Union disintegrated. Russia would have veto power over the foreign policy choices of its non-NATO neighbors. This would ensure that pro-Russian governments are in power in countries bordering Russia, including foremost Ukraine. So a quick little summary statement there of recent demands made to NATO and the US by Putin, and once again, largely considered non-starters. So far, no Western government has been prepared to accept these extraordinary demands, and we've read analyses together in the last little while that suggest the demands were written in a way that they could never be assented to, suggesting that they were a sort of window cover or pretext for further military action. The US and Europe widely embrace the premise that nations are free to determine both their domestic systems and their foreign policy affiliations. From 1945 to 1989, the Soviet Union denied self-determination to Central and Eastern Europe and exercised control over both domestic and foreign policies of Warsaw Pact members through local communist parties, the secret police, and the Red Army. When a country strayed too far from the Soviet model, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, its leaders were ousted by force. The Warsaw Pact was an alliance that had a unique track record. It invaded only its own members. The modern Kremlin's interpretation of sovereignty has notable parallels to that of the Soviet Union. It holds, to paraphrase George Orwell, that some states are more sovereign than others. Putin has said that only a few great powers, Russia, China, India, and the United States, enjoy absolute sovereignty, free to choose which alliances they join or reject. Smaller countries such as Ukraine or Georgia are not fully sovereign and must respect Russia's strictures, just as Central America and South America, according to Putin, must heed their large northern neighbor. Russia also does not seek allies in the Western sense of the word, but instead looks for mutually beneficial, instrumental, and transactional partnerships with countries such as China that do not restrict Russia's freedom to act or pass judgment on its internal policies. Such authoritarian partnerships are an element of the Putin doctrine, says this article called The Putin Doctrine in Foreign Affairs, published today, having a look at to see if there's anything here that we could learn that's new. The president presents, or it doesn't have to be new, it could be just well-stated, time-tested, and true. The president presents Russia as a supporter of the status quo, an advocate of conservative values, and an international player that respects established leaders, especially autocrats. As recent events in Belarus and Kazakhstan have shown, Russia is the go-to power to support embattled authoritarian rulers. It has defended autocrats, both in its neighborhood and far beyond, including in these places. Well, okay, I'll just say it for those of you who are listening and not reading: Cuba, Libya, Syria, and Venezuela. The West, according to the Kremlin, instead supports chaos and regime change, as happened during the Iraq War and Arab Spring. Guys, I'm going to keep going through this so that we can finish it. I got to tell you, I'm not really seeing anything new or interesting in this article. It's just a very ordinary presentation of the basic contours of the dispute between Russia and the West. I'm not so sure that it deserves to be branded the Putin doctrine or anything like that, but let's continue. In its own sphere of privileged interests, Russia can act as a revisionist power when it considers its interests threatened or when it wants to advance its interests, as the annexation of Crimea and the invasions of Georgia and Ukraine demonstrated. That's not Putin doctrine, that's just politics. Russia's drive to be acknowledged as a leader and backer of strongmen regimes has been increasingly successful in recent years, as Kremlin-backed mercenary groups have acted on behalf of Russia in many parts of the world, as is the case in Ukraine. How much longer is this? Oh my goodness. Okay, hold on. First of all, author is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, former national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia, author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West, with the rest. To the extent that people are doing this kind of analysis, you can't do better than to go to the horse's mouth and to study the ideologues of multipolarity, the political philosophers of distinct Russian civilization. But all right, let me go back. Taking it slow and being thorough. Let's go through. Oh my goodness, where do we stop? Here we go. So far, no Western government has been prepared to accept. No, we already read that. I don't want to read this. Okay. Given Putin's ultimate goal, given his belief that now is the time to force the West to respond to his ultimatums. Yeah, this idea here that the goal's been there. I mean, this is not a new goal from 2022, 2021. Those of you who watch the relations between Russia and the West know this is an old story. But the question is now the time to force the West to respond to his ultimatums? Can Russia be deterred from launching another military incursion into Russia? No one knows what Putin will ultimately decide, but his conviction that the West has ignored what he deems Russia's legitimate interests for 3 decades continues to drive his actions. He's determined to reassert Russia's right to limit the sovereign choices of its neighbors and its former Warsaw Pact allies and to force the West to accept these limits. But the West is not powerless. The US should pursue diplomacy, impose costs on Russia. The current crisis is ultimately about Russia redrawing the post-Cold War map and seeking to reassert its influence over half of Europe based on the claim that it's guaranteeing its own security. It may be possible to avert a military conflict this time, but as long as Putin remains in power, so will his doctrine. Okay. Like I said, reading this together with you for the first time, I didn't think that was a very good article. Okay, it's a nice primer for people who have no background knowledge of the relationship between Russia and its opposition to NATO expansion. And for the rest of us, no. Okay, some things on Zemmour. Get to that shortly. What do we have here? What happens next in Ukraine could change Europe forever. This is Time magazine. Again, I just pull these up, guys, over the course of the day as I'm doing this or that online. There's an article that comes up across my feed. This one by this author who is familiar to me and hopefully has something interesting to tell us on the topic, what happens next in Ukraine could change Europe forever. So yeah, I am actually looking forward to reading this. Let's pop over to the chat. Say hello, those of you who are here. Nice to see you. What's being said in the chat? I haven't looked. Good evening, good evening, good evening. James, D. Lars, Jim Bowden, William. Nice to be with you. Do I know Dr. Tom Sunik and Alain de Benoit? Yes, I read something by Tom Sunik that was published by Arctos 5, 6, 7 years ago. Can't remember exactly what it was. Something about right-wing anti-liberalism, but I don't remember the details. Alain de Benoit, don't know him as well as I should. I have read some of his works, some of his essays, and I know something about his relationship to Dugin and something about what he represents in terms of his role in the European New Right. But I'm not an expert, not by a stretch, but I do know about both authors. Miller Mania, yeah, thanks, nice to see you, as I say. Tom Sunik, a good friend of Jim's. He's retired and spends most of his time researching and writing. Well, very nice, good. So those of you who are watching this who have an interest in that, feel free to follow it up. Is there any outlier of perspective I've seen regarding this topic other than the usual Nord Stream sanctions, basic political posturing? Not really, not yet. So far, it's pretty standard, fair overviews of what might happen, a lot of speculation, mind reading, guessing, playing out the scenarios, some things that I didn't know too well going in. You think about if Russia gets kicked out of the SWIFT system, how that plays out and things like that, but wouldn't say anything I would regard as an outlier. It's all been, like I say, pretty standard fare, but continue to pull up articles, read over them, try to learn something new. And if anybody has good analyses of China's potential view on what's going on, that would be nice. But like I was talking to someone earlier today who mentioned rightly that, in Russia and China and in some of these other places, they understand that sometimes the best thing to do is just to be quiet, keep quiet, and not say everything you think about what might happen or what you might do, but just to keep your cards close to your chest. Anyways, let's read this. I don't know how to pronounce Bruno's last name, but he was Portugal's Secretary of State for European Affairs. He's currently a consultant at Flint Global. He's the author of Dawn of Eurasia and most recently, Geopolitics for the End Time. His Twitter account's not there, but he's on Twitter. You could follow him, and that's where I saw him posting this account. A consensus is beginning to form that a new war in Ukraine has become inevitable. In large measure, this is due to the escalation in both rhetoric and military preparedness coming from Moscow. Combined, they create a situation where the costs of retreating for Russia might now be too high. The clout and credibility acquired over the last decade, which people close to the Kremlin applaud as a return to superpower status, would suddenly evaporate were President Vladimir Putin to order the troops amassed on Ukraine's borders to return home. I don't know about that. I don't think that's necessarily true. Everybody here has something at stake. Who backs down, who speaks up, who gets what, who manages to wrest hundreds of millions of dollars of support for their coffers, and who gets to increase their status as a player on the world stage. It's not just an escalation in rhetoric and military preparedness from Moscow. There are many different players in the game. They each have their own interests. They're each operating according to their own logic, but things could accidentally get out of hand, out of control, go too far. I don't like this opening paragraph. In large measure due to the escalation in both rhetoric and military preparedness coming from Moscow. Okay, yeah, fine. From the point of view of Western perception, that's true enough. At present, how do I close? At present, it seems very unlikely that the Kremlin will get more than symbolic concessions from Washington, much fewer than it perhaps hopes to get after more concrete tokens of Russian determination. The problem is not just that Washington will never make the kind of commitments about NATO expansion that Russia has demanded. That's been a constant enough theme in the analyses that we've been looking at together. But that most people in the Biden administration think such commitments are a red herring. We've also encountered this argument. Putin is less interested in substantive commitments than in the spectacle of Russian assertiveness and American retreat. So you could ask about each of the countries and all of the countries that are involved. What sort of spectacle are they interested in? Let's assume that nobody actually wants war. What version of this spectacle does everybody hope goes their way? The symbolic wins, the narrative wins, the InfoWar space. Assuming that on the hot war and cyber war front, nothing ever escalated, what kinds of quote-unquote narrative victories is everybody trying to get? I don't think that's the most productive way of looking at it, but it's one way of looking at it. A deal would invite further provocations from an emboldened Russian leader, hence the gloomy forecasts. The question were Russia to make a move is what kind of what kind of move, I guess, would it make? Kremlin insiders such as longtime foreign policy advisor Karaganov have downplayed the prospect of an invasion followed by territorial occupation as leading nowhere. The seizure of Ukraine is not included in our military plans, he recently said. As though he would say the seizure of Ukraine is included in our military plans. If only for the reason that capturing a country with a destroyed infrastructure and an angry population is the worst possible scenario. Well, that may be true. Similarly, a document authored by a number of leading Ukrainian military experts argues that a large-scale offensive operation in an attempt to hold large occupied territories is an adventure that has no chance of a positive outcome for Russia. That's not similarly, that's different. This is them saying you couldn't pull it off. And this is them saying, we don't want to. Why would we even try? One mooted possibility is an amphibious invasion through the Sea of Azov. Such an operation would not be easy to accomplish. Ukrainian forces have been preparing for just such a scenario since 2014 and would be able to put up sufficient resistance that a Russian invasion would become prohibitively costly, measured in either Russian casualties or the time needed to conclude the hostilities. Russia could always combine a ground invasion with massive air support, but at what cost in civilian lives? Okay, gaming out the scenarios. As a former European head of state put it to me this week, the big question is whether it will also be an air war. If yes, it will be a slaughter. If not, it will not be easy for Russia. Putin is certainly aware of the dynamics of public opinion in Western democracies. News of repeated atrocities in Ukraine would lead to the adoption of the most punitive economic sanctions, which, as we've discussed, you couldn't even necessarily say how punitive they could be if there are countries like Germany unwilling to join in, and others that go the way of Germany. Then there's the possibility of a Ukrainian insurgency inevitably supported by the West. In urban areas and in the west of the country, Russian troops and even transport convoys would be subject to isolated but deadly attacks. Sabotage would be another weapon of Ukrainian insurgent groups, and even targeted assassinations could not be ruled out. Can anything be ruled out in a time of war? I would hope, if you're the one responsible for winning it, that not too many things would be ruled out. When I talked to a number of security and intelligence officers in Kiev in 2018, Bruno continues, they offered that argument as a final reassurance that Russia would not try to invade and occupy further Ukrainian territory, including the famed land bridge connecting the Donbass to Crimea, or isolated bridge heads somewhere on the Black Sea coast. Sorry, let me just make sure I understood that. We understood that. So he talked to a number of security intelligence officials, and they offered that argument as a final reassurance that Russia would not. What argument? The argument that Russian troops and convoys would be subject to isolated but deadly attacks. In other words, they can't do it because we will resist them. I'm not sure how far that goes as analysis, but okay. Although militarily less ambitious and therefore less risky than an outright invasion and occupation, other kinds of military intervention might be politically bolder, as the intervention in Syria in 2015 undoubtedly was. One model Putin might be tempted by is the punitive strike. In a way, he would be mimicking American practice, as exemplified by the airstrikes Bill Clinton ordered against Iraq after it refused to cooperate with weapons inspections, while overturning the existing American monopoly on the use of military power, a monopoly already breached in Syria. The logic of a punitive strike would flow naturally from the ratcheting up of tensions we've seen in recent weeks. New incidents may be manufactured in coming days, after which Putin would address Russia in the world, explaining he had no alternative but to order a series of airstrikes and limited ground operations against targets inside Ukraine. That doesn't sound like it's going to happen. As a way to eliminate a direct threat against Russian interests. His goal would be to degrade Ukrainian defense capacities, provoke a political crisis in Kiev, and affirm a new precedent for Ukraine and beyond. Okay, maybe. Using the medicine of the United States against this area of interest that the United States believes it has. A symbol of imperial power rather than an ugly battle for territory. After a humiliating military defeat, Ukrainian President Zelensky might even be ousted by a Moscow-aligned new government in Kiev, as suggested by revelations from the British Foreign Office over the weekend. So targeted strikes and a coup. And with Ukrainian defenses significantly degraded, Russia would be in a privileged position to launch new hostilities at any time in the future. Excuse me for a moment. I figured today, streaming a little bit later than usual, at the end of a day that was a little bit more stressful than usual. Thought I would indulge myself a little bit as we do this. If the strikes end after a week or so and mass civilian casualties are avoided, would they qualify as the kind of minor incursion President Biden thinks one could live with? Well, he did walk back those statements about a minor incursion, did he not? And have to do all kinds of explanation that he wasn't greenlighting an attack. But okay, fine. Nevertheless, maybe if there are these targeted surgical strikes, that'll be considered as something other than invasion. We know European countries remain deeply divided over what level of Russian aggression should trigger sanctions, with Germany even pushing for an energy exemption in proposed dollar sanctions on Russia. Given these constraints, the Western response might be kept within certain limits, but neither Ukraine nor world politics would survive unchanged. Okay, remember, after all, we're looking at these potential scenarios, but the argument of the paper is what happens next in Ukraine could change Europe forever. So a little bit of speculation here about what happens next in Ukraine. And now I guess he's going to transition to how it could change Europe forever. The existing security order in Europe would be broken beyond repair. Europeans would suddenly be living in a world where Russia would have a claim to intervene anywhere in its near abroad or even beyond, anytime it felt important interests were at stake. The Russian television anchor Dmitry Kiselev, known as a reliable Kremlin mouthpiece, explained on air during the past weekend that the current crisis is not about Ukraine. Quote, the scale is much bigger, unquote. He's right, but then the military endgame is unlikely to be the prolonged and costly battle for territorial control over Ukraine. A new Chechnya, as Boris Johnson called it earlier this week, that Western leaders keep warning Moscow about. The crisis is not about Ukraine, the author continues, but about Russia. If Washington is serious about limiting Russian power, it should focus less on what comes after a Russian attack than on offering Ukraine the tools to defend itself, especially during the initial stages of the conflict when air and standoff missile strikes will be deployed against military bases, power plants, key transportation nodes, and other critical infrastructure. A visit to Washington by Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov in November detailed an urgent need for air defense capabilities. Therefore, for military supplies and military spending. Ukraine believes the ability to shoot down Russian aircraft can deter Putin from invading. We no longer live in the old liberal order. Now, a lot of you maybe know that domestically, you no longer live in the old liberal order, and you have to see when, if ever, and how, if it does happen, the liberal international order will change. You know, there are different perspectives on that, different projects and programs. I don't need to tell you that Alexander Dugin's vision of multipolarity, where civilizations are the poles of a multipolar world, and that kind of thing is one model, but obviously you also have the unipolar world order, a multilateral world order, which is primarily US and its allies, and other kinds of contrasting and competing visions of world order. But okay, we no longer live in the old liberal order where rules must be enforced and violators punished. We live in a new order where power must be balanced with power. The US must reflect on whether it can afford to reduce its presence in Europe before a proper counterweight to Russia has been created in Brussels. The pivot to Asia that Biden talked about when pulling his troops out of Afghanistan and all of that may need to wait for a solution to the European crisis. As for Europeans, they need to quickly prepare themselves for a new world where their sovereignty and security may well be at stake. Economic sanctions may influence how the Kremlin plans its actions. By the way, I didn't say this prompt, but you can always post your thoughts in the chat, in the comments. There's always someone who comes here and gives a thumbs down. You could always just leave, you know. But okay, whatever, it doesn't matter. Leave your thoughts in the chat, in the comments, in reaction to what the argument is of any article we're going over. And guys, basically, as I've said before, and I'll probably say this just the last time now, these are articles I've pulled up for myself to read, but instead of reading them myself, I'm reading them with you. Those of you who prefer to hear them or like to have me go over them and make commentaries from time to time, that's just what this is. Economic sanctions may influence how the Kremlin plans its actions in the next few months and years, but they cannot change the underlying dynamics. The existing order is starting to buckle, and Washington needs to decide how best to replace it with new arrangements. I mean, you need to have the most competent statesman in a situation where the existing order is starting to buckle, and you, the existing superpower, have to react to that situation and control it and make sure it works out in your favor. Now, do we have outstanding statesmen at the peak of their game who have the historical knowledge and the understanding of political affairs, political realities, and the nature of political life? Do we have kinds of statesmen operating at that level today in the US and other Western nations? Because I think it's fair to say that Russia has some competent statesmen and a very competent foreign minister, and you just want to see them going head to head and toe to toe with equals. Does it prefer to reach a grand bargain with Moscow where the two powers divide Europe among themselves, or does it prefer to encourage and support the development of a new European pole capable of balancing Russian power? Should Biden spend the rest of his term in fruitless summits with Putin, or should he sit at the table with the European Union and Britain to discuss how Europe can become a sovereign actor in foreign policy and security? These are questions that we can say he poses to us. You can think about whether Biden should be spending his term in fruitless summits with Putin, or whether he should be strengthening Europe as a sovereign actor in foreign policy security, or doing neither of those, or some combination of both. To me, the choice seems an obvious one. But what's frustrating about the current crisis is how we keep avoiding the larger questions of political order. Yeah, one of the things that you can find out about Bruno, if you ever dig into his writing, is that he's at least willing to go beyond the given to the realm of interpretation, explanation, meaning, frameworks, paradigms, worldviews, and all of that. And therefore, he's a helpful resource. I wouldn't say he goes as far as some of the people we discuss here on this channel from time to time, but he goes further than usual. By hesitating to consider the larger questions of political order, we allow others to assume the role of reformers and innovators. Absolutely. Eurasia, the supercontinent, is being reshaped before our eyes. Okay, ideological, theoretical, and philosophical reformers and innovators who have a vision of world order are in an advantageous and advantaged position at a time where you have a transition from the old order to the new order, provided they have not only good ideas or viable projects and prospects, but also the military wherewithal and political capital to have them instituted. But you can't have great ideas and no power to institute them, or powerful institutions that have no vision. You need some combination of the two, and therefore reformers and innovators in international politics are going to reshape the Eurasian supercontinent. And the argument that I've been making over the years is that as we try to understand that, we should definitely pay some attention at least to the most eminent Eurasian ideologue, thinker, or innovator, Alexander Dugin. I think he gets us far along the question of a potential world order, whether we agree with his vision of it or not. Okay, this was Time Magazine. What happens next in Ukraine could change Europe forever. Apologize that I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but some of you may be familiar with Portugal's former Secretary of State for European Affairs and author of Dawn of Eurasia and Geopolitics of the End Time. Okay, going to pause between articles here for a minute. Let me just pull up what's next. Al Jazeera on Ukraine-Russia crisis. Somebody's Substack on German stubbornness. This long article by Vladimir Putin on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Do I have it in me? Tonight? Kind of long, but probably the most interesting thing we could read together. This older article about Transnistria. I think there was something else. Hold on. Ukraine case through a Russian perspective. Maybe we'll read that next. Yeah. Okay. Let me take a minute, go over to the chat, rest here for a moment, and then we'll read another article. Listen, I know this is not necessarily the world's most thrilling time together, but we're reading articles. What can I tell you? How do I pull the chat up? Okay. Nick, one of your favorite parts of the streams is when I break from reading and give my perspective. Thank you for that. It's just whatever comes up as I'm going through the article where I feel can add something. So those of you who know me, didn't just stumble on here but follow, you know that these are like, okay, Aristotle's Politics, Leo Strauss's Thoughts on Machiavelli, absolute masterpiece. Read it 100 times. My old philosophy professor, James Muir. Consider myself very, very fortunate to have started my study of philosophy with him. Here's his book, Legacy of Isocrates and a Platonic Alternative, History, Political Philosophy, and the Value of Education. Nice, important book. And last but not least, if we're just going over what I have by my side here, Heidegger's Basic Concepts. Not basic concepts of Aristotelian philosophy, but just basic concepts, different works. These are the kinds of books that normally I would like to be discussing with you, like to be teaching and studying, but I kind of got into this casual habit of live streaming the articles with you. So I want to keep that going a lot. I hope you don't mind. I'm having fun and people say that they are, but always keep in mind that the great texts of the history of political philosophy and people like Heidegger, Strauss, that's where you're going to get the most value for your time. And yet it's nice to just come back and see what's being written about and use the articles as a kind of test case for whether the analysis is going deep enough. We get to see the kinds of concepts that it uses and whether they're adequate. Anyway, what else is going on in the chat? Sometimes there are, how would you put it, people on these live streams who have been here before, so you guys can get to know one another, interact with one another in the chat and the comments. Just it's cool that we can do this. Hi, KC. Very, very nice that we can do this. Okay. This is the Ukraine case through a Russian perspective. Here's the author. Don't know who he is. And it's also a publication that I don't know, dailysabah.com, S-A-B-A-H, dailysabah.com. Came across my feed at some point. I thought I'd pull it up. Let's read it. Having taken note of Daily Sabah's latest interview with my honorable Ukrainian colleague, Ambassador Vasyl Bodnar, and given the importance of the issues he raised, I presume it to be fair to use my legitimate right of response. Does that mean we should go there first? I do hope you will find it possible to publish my letter in full. I'm going to sign it. Some weeks ago, Daily Sabah refused to publish a frank and fair reply to one of the Daily Sabah's publications by a famous Russian blogger because of his anonymous status. Though I always thought that arguments and ideas are more important than their form and shape. Well, you can't really separate. Okay, you know what he means, right? It means that who cares whether it was made anonymously or not? Let's just consider it on its own terms. But okay, he's not going to be anonymous. He's going to sign it. By the way, what do you guys think about people who publish anonymously? We kind of had that debate back with Peterson's attack on Twitter anons. First, despite all the noise my fellow colleague and the whole Western propaganda machine are making regarding it, what's happening now is not about Ukraine. With all my respect to this country, it's about Russia and its national interests, its security, first of all. And this said, it's about relations between Russia and NATO, Russia and the US. I wonder, if you're in Ukraine, if you're Ukrainian, if you're very much concerned about Ukraine's safety from the inside looking out or from the outside looking in, it's got to be pretty annoying to see all of these articles telling you that it's got nothing to do with Ukraine when you're like, well, it's, my family's life is at stake. My children's future is at stake. My streets will become unlivable. And yet, I'm relighting my cigar if anybody's wondering why I'm looking down and why I stopped reading. Indeed, we sincerely think that the alliance moving closer and closer to the east in our borders constitutes a serious threat to our national security. This is why we demand that NATO curtails certain actions, including stationing advanced offensive strike weapons in areas close to Russia, including Ukraine. Is Russia justified in its demands and in its concerns about NATO expansion? If it is justified, on what grounds? Wouldn't it do the same thing if it could, if it was in NATO's position? And if Russia's not justified, I'm asking you so that you guys can hash this out in the comments and in the chat. Why wouldn't Russia be justified? So on one hand, you have this big, great power, historical culture and civilization, nuclear power. And it's saying, look, you have a different understanding of the world. You have a different understanding of politics. You have a different understanding of man. You have a different understanding of time, historical progress, values, good and bad, right and wrong. Look, even if you have the cynical interpretation that it's all quote unquote strategic conservatism coming out of Russia, that they don't actually believe what they say, still, at the level of civilizational cultural analysis, there's a distinction between Russia and the West, and Maybe they don't love the idea that that distinction could be erased as the West creeps closer and closer and closer to Russia's doorstep. But on the other hand, you might say, look, Russia, your neighbors have every right to decide where they want to go. And we have every right to help them to decide and to sweeten the deal. Why should Russia be treated? I mean, why should NATO make any concessions? You know what I mean? Like, you have to try to see it, obviously, from the perspective of both actors, as well as from the inside looking out from Ukraine's perspective. There are a lot of different things at play here. It's just too simple. Like, one analysis says, well, look, NATO's going to expand. Yeah, Russia's a threat. You got democracies. You have authoritarian governments. Look at Putin. Putin's making friends with all the bad guys. NATO's making friends with all the good guys. Everybody who's undecided, we're just trying to win them over to the right side of history. There's like an unsophisticated version of that argument, but there's obviously a more thoughtful version of that argument, and vice versa. The Eurasian or the Russian or the view from the point of view of the quote unquote rest as opposed to the West, it also has its legitimacy, as do the nationalistic interpretations. No easy answers. Whoops, what did I do here? No easy answers. We just don't want cruise missile launchers to be based in eastern Ukraine, where their flight time to the heart of Russia, including Moscow, will be around 3 minutes. That seems very fair, doesn't it? You're Russia. You're responsible for protecting your citizens, your territory, your state, your history, and your sovereignty. Why would you be willing to have cruise missile launchers based in eastern Ukraine, where their flight time to the heart of Russia will be around 3 minutes? And aren't you fully justified in being determined not to let that happen? Moreover, isn't it criminally negligent for the West not to have total understanding of that determination and of its legitimacy, even if the West, NATO and the US, preserve in their determination to expand? In other words, the thing that always, at least in their public utterances, okay, in their public documents, the inability to acknowledge the legitimacy of Russia's concerns is perplexing. It makes me worry about the competence, imagination, the understanding, and the comprehension of Western experts. They just simplify in this over-exaggerated manner the desire to understand the legitimacy of the Russian position, which isn't to excuse it, not necessarily even to support it, but just to see where they're coming from, which, again, I think is a requirement for international statesmanship. It's not about letting Russia walk all over you. It's that you want to know what you're dealing with. You know, like, it just seems elementary to me, and I find that Western experts are bad at it. Is such a desire peculiar or illegal, this Russian desire not to have cruise missile launchers 3 minutes away? Is such a desire peculiar or illegal? I don't think so. Here's a good example from history. When late U.S. President John F. Kennedy learned in 1962 of a possible stationing of Soviet nuclear facilities in Cuba, he immediately reacted by declaring a naval blockade of the island, and furthermore rallied the U.S. Army and Navy to prepare for a preventative strike against Soviet missiles in Air Force bases. No one has ever blamed him for that. A close presence of potential adversaries striking forces is an existential threat to any power. Okay, again, I just put it to you, those of you who are watching now or who will be watching later. He's making an argument. A close presence of a potential adversary's striking forces is an existential threat to any power. Isn't it? Ukraine's entering NATO is definitely an equal threat to Russia, whatever you say. Like, you can deny it, but that's not going to make it any less true. What is important in war and politics is the real potential, not intentions or empty declarations. Second, Trying to limit the sovereignty of other countries. By the way, I already like this article more than the previous ones, and not just because it's coming from the Russian perspective, and you might think I'm more sympathetic to it because of my work on Russia. No, it's because you have to acknowledge the basic reality of war and politics, of threats, of what it means to be or not to be, and how that relates to potential adversaries striking forces. In other words, you have to see, just like we have to see the legitimacy of Ukraine's concerns, and you got to understand why NATO would want to tell Russia to get lost. So, you know, anybody who doesn't acknowledge this right here, where is it? This right here, this is just textbook. This is 101. Close presence of a potential adversary striking forces is an existential threat to any power. Well, maybe some powers can, what's the word? Can absorb a strike. You know, not every adversary, not every threat is a mortal threat. Not every adversary is an existential threat. So there's that as well. Second, trying to limit the sovereignty of other countries and dictate how they should build their domestic and foreign policy. Well, sounds noble and even highly pathetic. In other words, full of pathos. But there's one sad reality. When you enter a military alliance, you inevitably hand over at least part of your national sovereignty to someone else, be it an allied headquarters, an operational command, etc. So those who want to enter a bloc must subordinate their political will and military capacities to someone else's vision and assessment, sometimes even to dictate, for example, from the other coast of the Atlantic. Like if you join a security bloc, you have to live by the rules of that security bloc, meaning you have to subordinate your political will and your military capacities to somebody else. That sounds accurate, isn't it? Okay, are you okay with this? Oh, really? So they're the good guys. They're fighting against the bad guys. So here, okay, this argument is like, look, everybody must be sovereign. Everybody must be sovereign. Well, really? People give up their sovereignty when they join a bloc, and you are a bloc. So obviously sovereignty is not your highest goal because people sacrifice their sovereignty when they enter your bloc. So we move away from the argument from sovereignty to the argument from morality. Good guys and bad guys. They're fighting against the bad guys. They would never suppress the will of peoples and their freedom and sovereignty, would they? And you know, in the good guy, bad guy logic, if you limit somebody's freedom, it's for the sake of the common good. It's okay. It's justified. Yeah, it's true. You have to show a vaccine pass. You know, yeah, it's true. You know, you lost your job. Yes, you had privileges and now you don't. You know, yes, you used to make your own decisions and now we make them for you, but it's okay because that is for the sake of the good. But when that happens over there with the other side, then it's authoritarian, then it's dictatorial, totalitarian, fascistic. We leaving anything out? What about such glorious NATO actions as the resolute support mission in Afghanistan, so happily terminated, or bombing out the Serbs, or a regime overthrowing operation in Libya that has given us all a headache up to now? Wasn't the sovereignty of these countries people torn to pieces? In other words, as typical an argument as you could ever make in politics, namely accusing the other side of hypocrisy. Weren't these people subject to a rude and merciless NATO dictate? If someone is happy with that, let them be. It's their right. This author continues. But if I were the one to decide, I would try my best to avoid situations where my country's neighbors, nourishing such sentiments, would have a chance to be integrated into military alliances of such a reputation, seeking to deploy their most sophisticated strike weapons with close proximity to my borders. So in other words, from his perspective, it's not just about Ukrainian sovereignty. How could it be if Ukraine is going to enter NATO and by doing so is going to give up its sovereignty to the dictate of the NATO Central Command? Third is Donbass. It's a real bleeding wound. It's eastern Ukraine for those of you who don't know, those breakaway regions of Donetsk and Lugansk. It's a real bleeding wound since the Kiev regime started a civil war there against its own people in 2014. You say Ukraine lost 66 soldiers in 2021. It's more deplorable, but please keep in mind that the people of Donbass during the same period lost 77 people, 7 of whom were civilians. Since the start of the conflict, 5,038 people have been killed in Donbass, including 91 children. It's really a black hole when you get into the quantification of the deaths. You know, you 66 on this side, 77 on this side, 5,000 since the start, 91 children. The universe dies with every death, and nevertheless, the numbers do matter. You say Russia's concentrated more than 100,000 troops. You guys have all seen that figure, not just in our streams, but in other news sources. Why on earth is no one interested in how many Ukrainian troops are located there and how many state-of-the-art Javelin anti-tank missiles and drones are deployed in the region? So if you remember, you may see a map of Russia's forces, but you have a question. You don't usually see the Ukrainian forces depicted. That's what he's saying, right? What about the Ukrainian troops? How many are there? Where are they? Are they threatening? What kind of equipment supplied by the West is pointing into Russia and into Donbass? Finally, I would like the readers of Daily Sabah, by the way, I'm sure somebody watching this knows very well this publication. I don't. This is the first thing I've ever read by them. I would like the readers of Daily Sabah to know that Russia is ready for an agreement on the presumption that it's a fair and equitable one, taking into account our legitimate security concerns. We would be happy to conclude such a deal, and we would be more than happy if our Western partners luckily sell it to our Ukrainian brothers, appeasing their exacerbated fears and long-cherished complexes. A fair and equitable deal. All right. Ambassador of the Russian Federation to the Republic of Turkey. That's who that was. So does that change your impression of this article? We already knew it was somebody reflecting Russia's point of view, making some arguments for Russia's justified concern, the legitimacy of Russia's concern. Does it change your opinion about the arguments at all that this is ambassador of the Russian Federation to the Republic of Turkey? I assume, therefore, that this is a Daily Sabah is somehow Turkish newspaper, press. Let's see. Turkey calls for thaw in Ukraine-Russia tensions. Let's just read that too. Had some Germany on the table, haven't really read. From Turkey, Putin accepts Erdogan's invitation to visit Turkey. You can't see that, my head's over top of it. Turkey calls for thaw in Ukraine-Russia tensions. All right, while we're here, unless there's a paywall, read this as well. Going to throw the chat up and do something here for a minute. Yeah. Tony, testosterone. How you doing? Donetsk, Lugansk, regions in Ukraine. Donbass, Russian-speaking East. Okay, these are all things that you'd need to know something about. Just a quick glance at a map will help with an initial orientation. Oops. Turkey's National Security Council called for de-escalation in tensions between Russia and Ukraine late Thursday. Now we're early Friday. The council, chaired by President Erdogan, also underlined that escalation is not in the interest of anyone, calling on both sides to exercise restraint. What do you think? Is this true, that escalation is not in the interest of anyone? It's got to be in the interest of somebody. In an interview broadcast on Wednesday, Erdogan said Turkey is ready to host the leaders of Russia and Ukraine to pave the way for reestablishing peace as tensions between the two countries show little signs of diminishing. This is a topic that's come up, obviously, in Russian news sources with some skepticism, given the history of Russian-Turkish relations. Turkey wants tensions between Russia and Ukraine to be resolved before they turn into a new crisis, the president stated. I repeat that we're ready to do whatever is necessary, and I conveyed these messages to President Putin and President Zelensky, Erdogan said. I think both countries are aware of the sincerity and good intent of Turkey. The crisis should be solved, avoiding the use of force, he added. We hope the NATO initiative will be successful on this or in this matter. I hope that Russia will not launch an armed attack or occupy Ukraine. Such a step would not be a wise act for Russia or the region, he said. There's a need for dialogue that will listen to Russia and eliminate its reasonable security concerns. Erdogan also announced that he'd invited Putin to Turkey. He had invited Putin to Turkey, but the date is yet to be set. The Kremlin leader later announced that Putin had accepted Erdogan's invitation to visit Turkey. He meanwhile reiterated Turkey's clear stance on Ukraine's territorial integrity. Turkey has reiterated many times its commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity, he said. Turkey has been, by the way, this reminds me of like Politics 101, reading papers in Pol 101 as a TA, you know, where on one hand you have the direct quote and then you have the like restatement of the direct quote. Well, this is, he meanwhile reiterated Turkey's clear stance. Turkey has reiterated many times its clear stance on Ukraine's territorial integrity. Turkey has been closely following the developments and is in close contact with both Kiev and Moscow. Erdogan said Turkey could mediate between the neighbors amid increasing tensions in the region and recently announced plans to visit Ukraine in February to help diffuse tensions. You guys ever watch Curb Your Enthusiasm? Larry David? If you do watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, maybe you've seen the Pickle Jar Gambit. The episode of the Pickle Jar Gambit, that when there's a pickle jar to be opened, everybody wants a crack at it. Somehow you get a little bit of a Pickle Jar Gambit vibe. Oops. Get a bit of a Pickle Jar Gambit vibe around everybody wanting to mediate, host the discussion, host the conversation, ease the tensions. Respect both sides, respect both parties, give everybody a win. Everybody wants a crack at the pickle jar. Kiev has also bought Turkish drones to possibly use against Russian-backed forces in eastern Ukraine, angering Moscow, and agreed with Ankara to manufacture the drones locally this year. Meanwhile, both Russia and Ukraine are open to the idea of Turkey playing a role in easing tensions between the two countries, as proposed by Ankara in November, according to Turkish diplomatic sources. It's not the impression I got watching the Russian political commentaries recently, but take that with a grain of salt because they'll say anything. All right, that was Daily Sabah, a couple of articles from there. What else? Probably not going to be tonight. This article by Vladimir Putin on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, July 12th, 2021. I'm going to leave it for another night. German stubbornness, the world's first passive-aggressive power. No idea who this is. Muzzlevelocity.substack.com. Should we even look at it? Does anybody know who this is? Germany asked for an energy exemption to sanctions against Russia. No one is surprised that Germany would do this given their energy dependence on Russia. Furthermore, this underlines President Joe Biden's point in a press conference last Friday: NATO is a divided alliance. These parties are constantly jockeying for position against one another. The German consternation about sanctions on Russia comes simultaneously as the European Union is launching a trade dispute against China over Lithuanian exporters. Under the chancellorship of Angela Merkel, China and Germany increased their trade relations. However, a tremendous amount of pressure in Germany now to minimize ties with China, especially after Chinese trade practices harmed other members in its multinational organizational agreements. The current government of Germany launched protests over the trade dispute. What do you think the Olympics in China are going to signify for all of this activity? Something going to happen? Something more likely to happen? Less likely to happen during the Olympics in China? What do we have here? Klitschko left speechless as Germany sends 5,000 helmets to Ukraine, not 100,000. Okay, going on further in the article, the practical to the point of autism while simultaneously engaging in endless platitudinal posturing. The German government supplied 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. Anecdotally, has more photos of Ukrainian irregulars training with cardboard rifles, slick meaning without battle gear, demonstrate the raw lack of critical soldiering supplies in Ukraine. Retired champion boxer and mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, rightfully criticized the German response. The more important question is, can Germany supply more? Do they care? And why can't Ukraine afford these things? Especially given Ukrainian oligarchs embezzling money in Dallas, Texas, is there an incentive to the Germans who rightfully have a lack of patience with the more corrupt countries in Europe? It's all about the gas prices, the Achilles heel for Germany. The green energy activism there is shutting down nuclear power reactors, while Russia is more than happy to provide them with energy. However, this energy relationship could be a carrot for improving Western and Russian relations eventually, where Russia trade normalization increases incentives to back Western powers over China. Okay, just a little short comment there. German stubbornness, muzzle velocity. Don't know what that is. Nothing new for us. Al Jazeera. Why do I have this here? Russians hope for peace as the world talks of war. No. Let's go over to something that's definitely going to be interesting. This is now off Russia-Ukraine. Well, it involves Russia-Ukraine, but it's a little bit of a shift to Zemmour. Zemmour presidency would see proud France extricate itself from the American protectorate. Zemmour laid out his geopolitical thought in a recent hour-long interview. He discussed Trump and the 2020 election, arms manufacture, Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, among other topics. Why don't we have a look at that? Greetings from Germany. Thank you very much. Greetings from Montreal. Nice to be with you. Now, this is a thread by Malmesbury Man. As you see here on Twitter, he posts threads from time to time that are extended translations of interviews given by Mr. Zemmour. The format of the program was a moderator. Let me just see. Is it going to be helpful for you if I make that bigger? There we go. Maybe that's easier for those of you who are looking at the screen at the same time. The format of the program was a moderator, along with several members of the media, asking pointed questions and debating. Common enough format on French television. The tone was contentious and at times tense. Zemmour was self-possessed and firm in his responses, as he often is. Roux began by asking Zemmour if he takes Donald Trump as his foreign policy model. No, Zemmour answered. If I take anyone as a model, it would be Charles de Gaulle. Asked what displeased him about the way Trump conducted himself on the international stage, he responds, I didn't say he displeased me, but I don't take a president of the United States as a model. I try to define a foreign policy for France. Off topic, only tangentially related. You ever watch a foreign film, subtitles, or you just know the language, Russian, French, whatever the case might be, and there's American music or English language music in the foreign film? It happens all the time, and you sort of get it because of the popularity of American music, but I personally don't like it if I'm watching a Russian movie like I did the other day and you hear an English song in it. You don't watch American movies and hear Russian songs in them. I don't like it. Okay, so likewise, Zemmour, don't take an American president for your model. You're the French president, take a French president for your model. Make France great again, Roux asks in a heavily accented English. For me, France is always great, so I don't need again, Zemmour replies. Next, Zemmour is questioned by a French military reserve colonel and pundit named Pierre Servant. He asks, do you think the election was stolen from Trump? Do you think American democracy is functioning normally? Zemmour replies, I have my doubts. I'm not aware of anything. I have no proof. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm thousands of kilometers away. It's another thing, right? I'm sitting here. I'm in Montreal at the moment. You're wherever you are. And we're pontificating and reading these analyses about countries that maybe we've never been to, maybe we'll never go to. Of course, it's an important intellectual exercise. You can still learn something. Even without traveling, Socrates never left Athens. We can still learn more than a little about human and political life from Socrates. So it's not like it's decisive if you're thousands of kilometers away, but somehow it does matter whether you're familiar enough with the country that you're analyzing to make sense of the analysis. I remember the election of John Kennedy in 1960 having been stolen. I remember the election of George Bush Jr. in 2000 having been stolen, so it wouldn't be a novelty in American democracy. But I don't have any proof. Then the interviewer asks, if you're elected and meet with Joe Biden, would you regard him as a usurper? You can't ask questions like that. That's a stupid question, because obviously if Zemmour becomes president, he's not going to regard Joe Biden as a usurper. I'm an adept of realpolitik, so I take other nations as they are. I don't give moral lessons. Yeah, I don't know. If you know about Zemmour, you know about his position for France. It's not devoid of moral lessons. But okay, this is maybe internationally, he says he doesn't want to teach other countries how to live. I don't judge others more or less democratic, more or less liberal. I don't define my foreign policy in relation to human rights. Realpolitik. He's not a liberal internationalist. One of the reasons people like him. One of the reasons people hate him. Depending on who those people are. Joe Biden is elected. He's the legal president of the United States, so I know only Joe Biden. Obviously. Next, they turn to Zemmour's well-known plan for France to exit NATO. Zemmour states, what is the legitimacy of NATO? You asked me about the legitimacy of Joe Biden, which of course I don't contest at all. On the other hand, I take the liberty of contesting the legitimacy of NATO. I think NATO is an organization that should have disappeared in 1990, 91, 92, when the USSR collapsed and the Warsaw Pact fell apart. Today, NATO only serves to justify American industry and the enslavement of European countries. It's what de Gaulle called back then the protectorate, Zemmour continues. I don't see the interest in continuing. I think France should be independent. And to show it symbolically, I would leave the integrated military command. But he says he would not leave NATO entirely for two reasons. To veto a possible admission of Ukraine, and to prevent NATO from becoming an anti-China pact. Next, they discuss arms manufacturing. Zemmour advocates for a fully independent French arms industry, from the atomic bomb to FAMAS, an old French assault rifle. He says that since Sarkozy brought France back under the integrated NATO command, France has taken the easy route and forgotten the golden rule of General de Gaulle to be completely autonomous in our defense industry. Today we have a military of samples. We have everything, but just a little bit. We could make war for 3, 4, 5 days, and then after that we need the Americans. To rectify the situation, he would increase the French defense budget. Next, he's asked what he would do as president of France if Russia invades Donbass. Nobody should fight for Donbass, not the US, not France, nobody in fact. This is some unrest. Is it necessary to set limits on Vladimir Putin, the moderator asks. Zemmour replies, but you know Putin is not a child. You don't set limits on him. He's a head of state, a major head of state, leader of one of the biggest countries on the planet. He's very respectable. We should respect him. He goes on to discuss the history of the immediate aftermath of the fall of the USSR, when Bush Sr. and Gorbachev came to a tacit agreement that NATO wouldn't expand into the former USSR. Obviously, the Americans have not respected their word. Putin has tried, like all Russians for 1,000 years, to have a protective zone, and the Americans have spent the last 30 years eating away at that zone bit by bit. Those of you who are just tuning in now or who flicked ahead to this part of the video, on the replay, this is a transcript provided here by Malmesbury Man of an interview today with Zemmour, the French presidential candidate. They took Poland, all the countries of Eastern Europe. Next, they went into Georgia, Ukraine. The moderator points out America didn't annex territory. And he responds, you know the Americans are intelligent imperialists. They don't annex, they protect, like all intelligent imperialists. I would like to know what the Americans would do today if the Russians started putting missile defense or troops in Cuba or Mexico. What I want to say is the Americans don't belong in Georgia or Ukraine. Putin's demands are legitimate, and that would normally be the role of France to say in this situation, Putin's demands are legitimate. The Southern Questioner interviewer then debates with Zemmour by casting Ukraine as a dwarf nation threatened by the immense Russian military. Ukraine doesn't threaten Russia, he argues. They simply want protection. Zemmour responds, it's not little Ukraine that threatens Russia, it's the United States. Again, anybody in politics must see that. So you don't know whether these interviewers are just lobbing questions to see how he handles them or whether they reflect the position that they actually hold. Because some of this is really 101. The interviewer here says, but the U.S. has lost interest in Europe. You know that's been the case since Clinton. Zemmour disagrees but is cut off, and he'll return to this point. The interviewer then raises the post-Soviet agreement with Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons that were stationed there in exchange for an agreement for inviolate borders. Nevertheless, Putin in 2014 annexed Crimea. Zemmour answers, did you think it was good for global security for NATO to bombard Kosovo and Belgrade when Kosovo wanted to leave Serbia? Those were inviolate borders, and yet that doesn't bother anyone. Once again, the good old-fashioned recourse to accusations of hypocrisy, which have a place because countries are hypocrites. As for Crimea, you know it has been Russian since the 18th century. To make a comparison, Lorraine and Corsica joined France at the same time. And you know very well that Crimea was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev during a night of drinking. More seriously, you know the Russians would never accept the occupation of the port of Sevastopol by NATO forces with American arms and ships. Okay, then they press Zemmour, saying he's avoiding the issue by giving history lessons. Is giving history lessons avoiding the issue? Can you understand the issue without the history lessons? Do our politicians insist on historical amnesia as a way of getting anything done or not getting anything done? So Zemmour is telling them something about history. Maybe they could learn something about history. The question is, what would be his plan as president in this or a similar situation? Would he accept one nation invading another based on historical justifications? You can't plan if you don't understand the past, Zemmour says. Now, if you say, should France defend the inviolability of borders, I would say to you, yes, obviously that has been the policy of France since 1945. But you really have to understand history if you want to plan. You have to figure out what's going to happen. I think we've entered a new era. That is to say, I think the post-war world is dead. By the way, if it's the case that the post-war world is dead, that means something for philosophy as well. Just looking at the chat, I see there's something crazy going on in the chat there. Innocent mistake, I'm sure. Not a problem. Not a problem at all. If the post-war world is dead, it's funny, William. If the post-war world is dead, that means something for those of us with an interest in political philosophy and political theory and political thought, because political philosophy in our time has been shaped by the post-war consensus. Political theory in our time has been shaped by post-war liberal zealotry. It's kept the serious study of questions of political philosophy off the table, using the spectrum of a slippery slope into Nazism and fascism, so that whoever wasn't zealously liberal or part of the left international critique of liberalism could only be part of a new resurgent Nazism or fascism, which is not a very, it's not an adequate way of understanding political philosophy, political theory, political science, political life, or anything. So if the post-war world is dead, too bad for the post-war world, but it may be an opportunity for political philosophy to reestablish its rightful role in the social sciences. I think there are going to be more and more conflicts, and we have to learn how to manage them, and that won't be easy. Later, Zemmour says, I'm not Vladimir Putin's advocate. I simply think we ought to be the friend of Russia and we ought to stop being the instrument of American maneuvers. Then Zemmour returns to the claim that America lost interest in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's not exactly the case. That is to say, America spends its time setting up the European countries against Russia. I just want to pause here for a minute to do like a public service announcement. What we're reading here, this Twitter user, Malmesbury Man, he has translated this interview that Zemmour had on French TV. And what I want to say to those of you who are watching now or watching later, if you speak a second language, if you know a second language, whatever that language is, bring something of value either into English or out of English, politics, literature, poetry. Start somewhere, translate. It's crucial. Okay, we need translators who are helping us to understand thinkers outside of our language. They're very smart people, great analysts, good arguments. There's a lot we could learn, but we need people translating. So, okay, consider that my public service announcement. If you can't translate, do something. You don't have to do a 1,000-page textbook or even a 200-page book. Take some interesting interview you heard, transcribe it, put it up like Malmesbury Man has done, and it'll be good for you because you'll become a better translator, and eventually you'll be able to move on to projects that make you money and that are book length and things like that. But it's also going to be a big contribution to like what we're doing. Here we are together reading because of Mr. Malmesbury Man. The great anxiety of the US for a very long time, since the geopolitical theorists of the end of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, Brzezinski, the advisor of Carter and Obama, has written very clearly about this model, has been to separate Russia from Germany and France. Each time there has been a rapprochement. We saw this during the 2003 Gulf War. The Americans set about finding ways to divide them. By the way, if you don't speak a second language, start learning one. Russia conducts a policy that effectively wants to defend and develop its influence. I think that France can and should show signs of friendship toward Russia. For example, in removing the sanctions. Thank you, William. Asked about Russian election interference, he says he's not worried about it. I thought I heard it was above all the Americans that listened to their allies, not the Russians. Here he's referring to the Obama-era spying scandal. And asked about building up an EU military force instead of relying on the US, Zemmour says European defense is NATO, and NATO is the United States. I think there can only be, as de Gaulle said, national defense. One only defends one's country, and Europe is not a country. So anybody watching this, what do you think about that claim? Is that accurate? All defense is national defense. Zemmour's position against security blocs and alliances, is he mistaken? Other subjects were discussed in the hour-long interview, but I've elected to pass them over as this thread is already very long. Here's a link to the full video. Okay, so I'll say thank you to Mr. Malmesbury Man. Follow him on Twitter, and you'll definitely see more threads of his on Zemmour because it's something that he does from time to time. Okay, let's see. Well, I'm going to be a little bit longer to finish this off. So I suggest this article here, somewhere between Moldova and Ukraine. Transnistria, relic of a frozen conflict. Let me just quickly see. Do they have a... Oh, it's behind a paywall. Is it? Subscribe to read more. Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Of course, you could pay and go behind the paywall, but I'm not going to do that now. What about this thread? Huntsman, man _ integrated. He does a lot of supply chain kind of threads. Logistics. You may have heard Ukraine has been in the news lately, but the real game of interest is not the impeachment proceedings. It involves, this is, I think, so this is an older thread of his that he recently drew attention to again because he thought that it would be relevant for anybody paying attention to Russia's interests in Ukraine. The real game of interest is not the impeachment proceedings. It involves a company few Americans have heard of, China, Russia, and some aircraft engines. All right. Ukraine, one-time Soviet nation and now Russian adversary, has a complicated history, little understood in the West. While it was once primarily known as a major agricultural region, it also has a few tricks up its sleeve, especially the defense sector. Now, this thread will unavoidably get deep into the weeds. Like one of my previous threads about China and animal feed, there are wheels within wheels intricately tied back to one another. I'll endeavor to keep it concise and clear. Tucked away in southern Ukraine, along the Dnieper River, is the city of Zaporozhye. I'm going to just forgive all pronunciation errors in this and all threads. I mean, all videos and all live streams, okay? I'm going to be mispronouncing a bunch of things. Don't make a big deal of it. Home to more than 800,000 people, the city is a heavy industrial center for Ukraine with manufacturing spanning steel, aluminum, autos, transformers, substations, and aircraft engines. Zaporozhye hosts the headquarters of Motor Sikh, a company designated by the Ukrainian government as a strategic enterprise. A remnant of the Soviet-era occupation of Ukraine, Motor Sikh is a manufacturer of engines and components for aircraft and drilling equipment. Motor Sikh engines power an estimated 80% of Russian-built helicopters, including the ones listed here and many others. Let's quickly break them down. So the MiL Me-2 Hoplite is a small, close air support multi-role helicopter. It carries troops, can be armed with rockets and machine guns, or fitted with reconnaissance equipment. 15 countries, including the US, have active inventory of one or more variants. Here it is, the MiL Me-2 Hoplite. And again, if this is like MI, MiL, MI, MiL Me, just roll with it. The MiL Me-817 HIP is one of the most produced helicopters in the world, with more than 50 countries holding some version or other in active inventory. Like its little brother, the Me-2, it can be configured in any way with more than 20 different variants. So again, he's going over these three Russian-built helicopters because the engines made in Zaporozhye power an estimated 80% of them. So the strategic importance of that, the strategic importance of this company located in Ukraine. The MiL Me-24 Hind is a legendary gunship that can also carry a small complement of troops. It's been used in more than 30 conflicts going back to 1977. While the original power plants were Russian-made, a newer variant, the Me-24P Hind F, uses Motor Sikh engines. Motor Sikh power plants were also used on the famous Antonov AN-225, the largest airplane ever built. It was originally built to transport the Soviet Buran space shuttle. More recently, China has come up with an even bigger plan for the megaplane, launching satellites. Due to sanctions related to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict going back to the 2014 Russian invasion of Crimea, Motor Sikh can no longer provide sustainment for the Russian military's massive fleet of helicopters. However, Motor Sikh decided to ignore that. From 2014 to 2017, Russian-born president of Motor Sikh allegedly continued to sell components to Russia through Belarus, using a sanction-dodging technicality. In April 2018, investigatory agents from the Ukrainian State Security Service, SBU, raided Motor Sikh. In the background, however, lurked China. Now you can see a nice movie kind of script here playing out. In the background, however, lurked China. For years, China had quietly increased its ties to Ukraine. Where Ukraine had been dependent on Russian buyers pre-2014, it struggled thereafter. Motor Sikh especially needed cash in new markets. China offered both. Okay, so this was doing big business with Russia, but then it pivoted to China and needed new cash in new markets after it was no longer able to do business. William, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Now that I know how to do it, let me just spotlight that super chat there from William. Thank you. I appreciate it. Through a complicated web of offshore companies, China managed to acquire a significant stake in Motor Sikh. between 2013 and 2016, rumored to be as much as 56%. A separate SBU investigation revealed that a single man, Wang Jing, controlled all of these shell companies. In 2017, one of Jing's companies, Beijing Skryzen, stepped forward with a bid to take control of Motorsikh. The ongoing investigation and sudden Ukrainian public awareness of control of a strategic enterprise by China sparked backlash. The deal has been iced since. Jing is an unknown player in the West, except for one project. He was the founder and public face of the effort to bypass the Panama Canal and build a larger canal joining the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans through Nicaragua. The project has since been mothballed. Per this news source, the main reason was that Jing lost a good bit of his fortune, primarily built in telecom and aerospace, in a market downturn in 2015. However, it did not slow Jing's other efforts to continue his stealth acquisition of Motorsikh. But it is the confluence of these things that's most interesting. Okay, so this company in Zaporozhye in Ukraine that had been building these engines for the helicopters. Okay, and now the China part of the picture is in. As I highlighted in my thread, he writes on China's missile program, the People's Liberation Army derives an enormous amount of black box funding through its network of shell companies. Aerospace and telecom are two such industries where the PLA is rumored to be highly active in ownership of commercial enterprises. Wang Jing especially is considered by outside observers to be a direct proxy for the interests of the Chinese Communist Party and PLA. Where this is going, we'll find out shortly. Further, it directly benefits the CCP and PLA to have a larger canal that cuts off North America from South America and allows for passage of much larger commercial and military naval vessels. As with Motorsikh, Jing seems to be acting as a proxy. Infrastructure, logistics, aerospace, PLA-connected enterprises. The Motorsikh deal and the known players fits a Chinese operational pattern of years-long gamesmanship, hidden hands, and multi-layered strategic planning, servicing many needs at once. If you're still with me, how many people are here? Congratulations, those of you who are here watching later, we're still with Man Integrated. Let's go to a deeper level. Having established Jing as a proxy for CCP PLA efforts, let's look at his main holding company. While it's involved in a great many activities, let's zero in on a specific sector, satellites. In 2016, this company began a $285 million purchase of Spacecom, an Israeli satellite manufacturer. Let me just add here and stop here and say that on one hand, when you go into the weeds, it's like companies and people, how they're interacting with one another, who bought or sold what, where, when, for how much, for what purpose, who took control, who ceded control. And it could be like, you don't necessarily want the details. You want the high level overview of, Russia and the West, Russia, NATO, who wants what and who doesn't. But the weeds are very important, okay? A lot of stuff happens in the weeds that is that you can't see from a very high level, but that's actually decisive to what happens and why it happens. So don't be afraid to go into the weeds from time to time. The deal was contingent on the successful launch of Spacecom's Amos 6 satellite. On the 1st of September 2016, Amos 6 was the payload on SpaceX's Falcon 9 launch vehicle. Then this happened. The Amos 6, whose primary user was to be Facebook, went up in flames, and so too did Spacecom's deal with Jinwei, that company. Jing pulled his firm from the deal and was back to square one on his efforts to acquire better satellite R&D and manufacturing capacity. In 2014, you guys can still see this, I hope, all nicely on the screen. In 2014, Jinwei successfully launched and tested the Ling Qiao Low Earth Orbit communications satellite in partnership with that university and China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. The technical data from Spacecom was to be a great leap forward. Undeterred, Jinwei pressed forward in February 2018. CASC disclosed it was planning to deploy a massive global network of LEO satellites, codenamed Hongyan, translated Wild Goose. And at the heart of it, Jinwei's satellite tech. Okay, we're going to need this thread to bring us back to Ukraine soon. With more than 300 satellites deploying by 2025, the Hongyan constellation is China's attempt to completely break free from the traditional fiber optic cable model that powers the global telecom industry. cable is vulnerable to breakage or sabotage. China demands better. Hongyan will connect directly to China's 5G network. China's 5G tech has also been the source of serious shenanigans, ably covered by Adam Scrabble, another good Twitter follow. The picture is clear now. China wants to dominate telecom infrastructure of the 21st century. Now, what does all of this have to do with Ukraine? We may be asking. Why is Jing and his Jinwei subsidiary, Beijing Skryzon, tied so closely to the acquisition of a troubled, sanction-riddled company like Motor Sich? 3 reasons. First, the massive sustainment requirements for the global fleet of helicopters using Motor Sich engines is a durable base of revenue and R&D. Second, Ukraine is a key node in the Belt and Road Initiative. And Ukraine also supplies a great deal of grain to China. Third, and most relevant to this thread, is the aforementioned Antonov AN-225. All of the intellectual property relating to its unique engines belongs to Motor Sich. Again, this company located in Zaporozhye in Ukraine. In 2016, China inked the deal for Antonov to complete the second unit. As of 2019, it's 70% done. Return your attention now to tweet 10 of this thread. In addition to carrying more cargo than any plane ever, you remember that huge, I'll pull it back up for us shortly. The Antonov AN-225 is also capable of being a LEO satellite launch platform. SpaceX's Falcon 9 cost $62 million for a single launch. Cost for the AN-225, $30,000 an hour. Even factoring in sustainment costs, the AN-225 is a remarkably more versatile and cost-effective launch vehicle for the Chinese satellites than the Falcon 9 or Chinese equivalent Long March designs. Liquid or solid fuel rockets are logistically difficult at best. As far as threads go, you can use Twitter for a lot of things, right? It's a nice thing from time to time to use it for useful, interesting, competent analysis. With hundreds of LEO satellites to launch and an enormous cost advantage, China's desire to stealthily acquire the secret sauce to high-altitude heavy lift capability makes all the sense in the world. It's worth 6 years of subversion and risk. The Hongyan satellite constellation is primarily aimed to service stakeholders participating in the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as isolated regions such as the poles. By breaking its dependence on terrestrial infrastructure, China closes a critical security gap. The full picture in Ukraine has yet to come clear. I won't speculate, he continues, on Hunter Biden's and Joe Biden's deep and murky connections to Ukraine and China, nor with the associated, at the time of this thread, ongoing impeachment process. What we know is that China has aircraft to build and satellites to launch. We know that China has invested many billions into Belt and Road and also wants to control the means of physical logistics and narrative logistics, telecom, through Eurasia. Further, a closed-loop telecom system is invaluable to China's burgeoning military ambitions. The purchase of Motor Sich would square all those circles. It would also secure Ukraine fully to China in a pragmatic way, at a time when China is the largest buyer of Ukrainian corn and Russian natural gas pipelines through Bulgaria and the North Sea now bypass Ukraine. President of the United States seems to know this. It's likely why a reputed stealth advisor, Eric Prince, of the notorious Blackwater and now Hong Kong-based Frontier Services Group, has stepped forward to purchase Motor Sich and its intellectual property records. The story, writing in November 2019, is far from over. If anybody knows, where does it stand January 2022? For the moment, it appears that China will not be able to cheaply launch the telecom complement to its BRI. Wan Jing, the PLA proxy, will not have his canal or aircraft engines, and Ukraine will stay more relevant than anyone realizes. So if I were to simplify this for us in 1 or 2 phrases, when we consider the importance of Ukraine, we have to keep in mind the importance of Motor Sich, because it's a strategic asset for China. It supplies engines for those aircraft, not just the Antonov or whatever it was called, but also for those helicopters. And therefore, it's a strategic asset that is of interest to players in the region and players who want to be in the region. related. Unsinkable aircraft carrier. Okay, some related threads he's posted to. Okay, that was that. You have to get into the weeds sometimes if you want to know what's going on. This was Huntsman Man Integrated, Made in America. Logistics is a map of human intent. Nice. Watch the choke points. And I think you should follow him on Twitter. And you should be willing to go into the weeds sometimes. Nothing is real until something moves. Logistics. Okay. All right. Good. Well, I'm glad we had a chance to read that. And maybe that's where we'll stop. Let's see. Is this up to date? Russian officials not optimistic but willing to keep communication open after U.S. makes no concessions on Ukraine. Denmark deploying additional aircraft and a ship to the Baltic Sea sends a message to Russia about the willingness by NATO countries to demonstrate their military capabilities and commitment to NATO partners during a crisis. A day after the United States hand-delivered a response to Russia regarding its security concerns, Moscow said it was clear the U.S. was not willing to address its main concerns. Okay, so no concessions on the key points, no diplomatic agreement, and no resolution at the moment. State Department vows Nord Stream 2 will remain a hunk of metal at the bottom of the ocean if Russian president makes moves on Ukraine. Fox News. Okay. Tensions on the Ukraine-Russian border escalate. Some Western powers are considering personal sanctions on President Vladimir Putin if Moscow invades its neighbors. Well, we'll look for more good articles tomorrow. Maybe that's a nice place to stop for today. I do kind of regret that we didn't get to this article by Vladimir Putin on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. But I started later than I wanted to, and it's longer than normal. So you can have a look at it, or maybe I'll take it up tomorrow. Please release as a podcast, says Stevie in the chat. You know, I'm surprised people have found these streams interesting because all I'm doing really is reading these articles. And I appreciate your being here, and hopefully it's contributing some new information, interesting analysis, and something maybe you wouldn't necessarily have read on your own, but you enjoyed listening to it. Okay, William, I like the new content. Millerman, thanks. And the old stuff, the current event stuff, been doing is great. Thanks. It's easy too, because like to make a video, if you go back over the old videos on Evola and things like that, I prepare a lecture. I try to present it as well as I can. I got to edit the video after the fact, add some pictures. Just putting this up for anybody who's looking for some reading materials. Whereas these streams, I could just sit down, turn on the camera, hit record or hit stream, and go through the articles. You know, it's great. Please release as a podcast. Glenn Beck chalkboard on Ukraine. Find it on YouTube. Find out exactly what Joe and Hunter were doing with Hunter on a company's board of direction in Ukraine. Again, thanks for that super chat, William. Okay, there you go. So I'd like to keep these streams going. If I find more articles to share with you tomorrow and I have the time and inclination, I'll do that. Chris, fun hanging out with you too. Good to be with everybody. Have a nice day. Stay safe. Be happy. Read good books. Leo Strauss, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Heidegger. Bye.